All right, picture this for a second. 9 police officers are gathered outside a 4th-floor apartment in Japan. Inside is a young man they urgently need to question about a missing British woman. Suddenly, the door flies open. A barefoot man wearing a rucksack just bursts right past them. In the sheer chaos that follows, he literally vaults off the final few feet of the stairway, hits the ground wearing a pair of athletic shoes he somehow managed to grab on his way down, and zigzags down the street, completely disappearing into the city. Okay, so that desperate escape, that marked the beginning of one of the longest, most intense, and frankly deeply unsettling manhunts in modern Japanese history. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a chronological, investigative look at the Tatsuya Ichihashi case. We're going to examine the tragic murder of 22-year-old Lindsay Hawker, unravel the massive 2.5-year nationwide manhunt that absolutely gripped Japan, and look at the truly extraordinary lengths one fugitive went to just to hide in plain sight.
Part 1. The disappearance. To really understand the gravity of this case, we first have to talk about who was at the heart of it all. Because Lindsay Ann Hawker was so much more than just a headline on the evening news. She was this vibrant 22-year-old woman with an incredibly promising future ahead of her. She traveled thousands of miles away from her home to immerse herself in a totally new culture, totally driven by a genuine spirit of adventure and a passion to teach. So she grew up in Warwickshire over in England, and she actually graduated with first-class honors from Leeds University with a degree in biology. Fast forward to October 2006, and she decides to move to Tokyo to work at a branch of the Nova English Conversation School. People who knew her described her as popular, outgoing, and just deeply dedicated to her students. She shared an apartment with 2 other foreign teachers. Honestly, she was exactly the kind of bright, ambitious person you would want teaching your own kids. And knowing what a promising life she had makes her final known movements all the more chilling. Let's walk through it. On Sunday, March 25, 2007, right around 10 a.m., Lindsay met a 28-year-old student named Tatsuya Ichihashi at a cafe near her home for a private English lesson. After the lesson, they hopped in a taxi and headed to his apartment in nearby Ichikawa, out in Chiba Prefecture. When they got there, she asked the driver to wait for her. Well, 7 minutes go by. She doesn't come back down, so the taxi driver eventually just leaves. By the very next morning, when Lindsay didn't show up for work, her colleagues knew something was wrong, and they immediately contacted the police.
Part 2. A tragic discovery.
The police actually acted super quickly on that missing persons report. They traced Lindsay's last known whereabouts straight to Ichihashi's door. And this brings us right back to that chaotic moment we started with. It's March 26. Officers arrive at his 4th-floor apartment. But as they step away just briefly to manage the situation and figure out their next move, Ichihashi slips away. He abandons a rucksack that had cash and gym clothes in it and just bolts. With their prime suspect now literally running down the street, the police enter the apartment. And what they found out on the balcony was horrifying. I want you to think about this number for a second. 110. That is the number of kilograms of sand and compost soil that investigators found completely packed into a bathtub that had been dragged out onto the apartment's balcony. Buried beneath all that mixture, bound and gagged with plastic ties and scarves, they found Lindsay Hawker's body. To put that in perspective, neighbors actually reported hearing sounds during the night, like something striking metal and being heavily dragged across the floor.
A post-mortem examination confirmed the tragic reality of what happened in that room. The forensic cause of death was manual strangulation. Her body showed extreme bruising, a fractured nose, and undeniable signs of a violent struggle and sexual assault. And we absolutely have to rely strictly on this verified physical evidence because, as you're going to see a bit later on, the suspect tries to spin a completely different self-serving narrative.
Part 3. The nationwide manhunt.
Because Ichihashi had that head start, what followed was a massive, multi-year pursuit that truly tested the absolute limits of Japanese law enforcement. They issued a nationwide arrest warrant and mobilized over 5,000 officers. Think about that scale for a second. CCTV footage of him was broadcast non-stop on national television. When the lead started running cold, the police got creative. They distributed wanted posters showing what he might look like disguised as a woman. They even deployed life-size talking cardboard cutouts at major train stations, practically begging the public for tips. And yet, somehow, he just vanished. So how exactly did he do it? Well, his evasion tactics were incredibly extreme. He lived this nomadic life, traveling from Amori way up in the north, all the way down to a concrete bunker on an island in Okinawa.
But the most shocking part, to avoid being recognized, he actually performed crude DIY surgery on his own face. I'm talking about using scissors to thin his lip and a literal box cutter to remove identifying moles. It's gruesome. Eventually, he blended into the urban fringes, working cash-in-hand construction jobs in Osaka for 13 months, all just to save up enough money for actual professional cosmetic surgeries. By the time June 2009 rolls around, sheer desperation had set in for the authorities. They hiked up the cash reward for any information leading to his capture from 1 million yen to a staggering 10 million yen. For context, that was roughly $100,000 at the time. The pressure was mounting. By this point, Ichihashi's face, or well, at least his original face, was known to almost every single person in Japan. And you almost won't believe the audacity of this guy. Years later, while he was actually sitting in jail awaiting trial, Ichihashi wrote and published a memoir called Until the Arrest. It detailed his entire fugitive lifestyle. The book sold over 100,000 copies, but as you might expect, it sparked massive public outrage. People felt it was exploiting this awful tragedy for profit. And worse, it deeply hurt the Hawker family by prioritizing the killer's perspective over the victim's dignity.
Part 4. Capture and Confession.
Ironically enough, it was Ichihashi's absolute obsession with hiding his identity that finally became his undoing. Let's trace how fast this all unraveled in late 2009. In October, he visited a cosmetic clinic in Nagoya for even more surgery, this time on his nose. But the medical staff there actually recognized his structurally altered face from the updated police sketches, and they tipped off the authorities. Finally, on November 10, 2009, police cornered him at a ferry terminal in Osaka. He was wearing a hat, sunglasses, a surgical mask, and was just about to board a boat to Okinawa. After 2.5 long years on the run, the fugitive was finally in handcuffs.
Now, once they had him in custody, Ichihashi's confession completely contradicted the hard facts we talked about earlier. He admitted to raping Lindsay, but tried to claim her death was just an accident. He said he only covered her mouth and neck to silence her screams so the neighbors wouldn't hear, but the prosecution's physical evidence absolutely shattered that excuse. The sustained force required for fatal strangulation, the severe trauma to her face, and the incredibly complex, premeditated concealment of her body under 110 kilos of sand. It all painted an undeniable picture of extreme, intentional violence.
Part 5. Justice for Lindsay.
The trial saw a relentless pursuit by the Hawker family to make absolutely sure this man answered for what he did. And on July 21, 2011, the Chiba District Court formally rejected Ichihashi's claims of an accidental death. They handed down a sentence of life imprisonment. The prosecution had specifically sought a life sentence rather than the death penalty. They noted that while the crime was undeniably heinous, Japan typically reserves capital punishment for cases involving multiple murders, and Ichihashi had no prior criminal record. Throughout this entire agonizing ordeal, Lindsay's parents, Bill and Julia Hawker, traveled to Japan time and time again. They handed out flyers in the streets, fighting tirelessly for their daughter. Upon hearing the final verdict, Bill Hawker fought back tears and delivered this incredibly poignant message to the Japanese public, the very people who submitted the tips that finally caught him. He said, "Lindsay loved Japan, and you have not let her down. Thank you."
Which really leaves us with a haunting final question, doesn't it? Does a life sentence truly balance the scales for a life so brutally and unfairly taken? And knowing that Ichihashi evaded 5,000 police officers for nearly 1,000 days using nothing but cash and a box cutter? Does this case permanently expose the terrifying reality of how easily a killer can just hide in plain sight? Thank you so much for joining me today to uncover the facts of this explainer, and I'll see you in the next one.